Hello pals and welcome to my May reading wrap up, and what a month it has been. In May I read an absolutely fantastic group of books and a really good mix of fiction classics, some non-fiction and a little bit of crime towards the end as well. Reading this month has brought me so much joy, and that was kind of the theme for the books that I chose. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a cup of tea. It's quite chilly here today. Grab your beverage of choice and we'll make a start. The first book that I read in May was Civil to Strangers by Barbara Pym. I am a forever Barbara Pym fangirl, and as I moved house in April, I wanted something kind of warm, reassuring, comforting, that genre of like intelligent comfort reading, of which you'll see quite a lot of in May's reading. Civil to Strangers was published posthumously, and this is actually a collection. It includes the novel Civil to Strangers, some short stories, some unfinished kind of drafts. This was published after her death in the 1980s, but the novel was written, I think, in 1936. This is set in Shropshire and follows the inhabitants of a village as they are kind of rocked by the arrival of a handsome single Hungarian man. As with all Barbara Pym novels, this is very much focused on the kind of minutiae of a very particular like social strata in which Barbara Pym moved in. So every Barbara Pym novel is populated by a cast of rectors and village kind of old dames and spinsters and academics. In this we follow a married couple. The man is a kind of rather like hapless, kind of obscure novelist. I enjoyed this, but I don't think that this is her kind of strongest work. If you want to read Barbara Pym, or you're thinking of where to head to next, definitely start with Excellent Women, and I would say that there are probably kind of stronger novels to head to after that. Having said that, I've exhausted pretty much all of her backlist at this point, and this was exactly what I wanted in the moment. Barbara Pym always reminds me of Jane Austen because they're doing the same thing, which is focusing on a very particular like strata of their social circles, being incredibly observant. After I finished Civil to Strangers, I headed to Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, as it's Jane Austen's 250th year. I'm rereading all of her novels across the course of the year. So far I've read Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion, and now Sense and Sensibility. I've read this a fair few times. It used to be my favourite Jane Austen when I was younger, very much influenced by the Emma Thompson film adaptation from the 90s, and I feel like this is a great Austen to be your favourite when you are a teenager. But coming back to it now, I have to say it doesn't compare to the kind of more mature Persuasion, to Pride and Prejudice. As I was reading this, I just kept on thinking to myself that Edward is a like wet mop, Marianne is kind of unbearable. So it's not my favourite Austen. I'd probably still rank it above Mansfield Park, but I will be rereading Mansfield Park this year, so I guess we'll wait and see until then. Having said that, even the worst Jane Austen is better than almost everything else that I could read, so I did still have a lot of fun with this. Sticking on the Jane Austen theme, I read Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney. I flew through this considering that this is a literary biog, also touches on kind of the ins and outs of kind of rare book dealing. This is focused on how Jane Austen becomes considered part of the canon, a classic as we know her today, and then the female writers who influenced her, who came before her, and female writers of her time who she drew inspiration from. The central thesis from this is that those women, such as Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, Charlotte Lennox, Hannah More, have kind of been unfairly removed from the Western canon. I really loved the conversational tone of this. I found this really easy to read. I also really loved the insight into the rare book trade, into how kind of rare book dealers choose which editions to go for, how they kind of sell the books that they acquire, and I also really loved how much time and care she took in choosing the books from the women writers that she had chosen. I could read far more on those topics. I also really loved the part on what it takes for a book to ascend and kind of become canon or become classic. So as an example, being championed by critics, Jane Austen is championed by George Henry. Is it Lewis or Lewes, who is the partner of George Eliot in the Victorian period? How you have to have a critical kind of framework behind that author, how their books have to be accessible, which means that they need to kind of be in print or be reprinted. It also needs to be picked up by teachers, and people need to be taught it so that a book can become part of a kind of shared cultural conversation. It also needs a healthy fandom. I guess the argument of this book is that Jane Austen has all of those things in buckets, but that the other female writers kind of mentioned here, each one of them gets a chapter, that they do not. Her realisation that she, as a rare book dealer, somebody who has a quite significant amount of knowledge of authors of Jane Austen's time, of kind of Regency England through to Victorian and the 20th century, she has an awful lot of knowledge in those areas, but she's largely unaware of the women writers that influenced Jane Austen, and that is, I guess, largely in part due to misogyny. My main qualm with this book is that bar two of the authors in this book, Hannah More and Hester Lynch Frail Piozzi, I think that's how you would say it, I know all of the women writers in this book and would consider some of them canon and an awful lot of them classics. I have been a bookseller. I was a bookseller for 6 years. I specialised in fiction and classics, so potentially that's kind of skewed my perception a little bit. But I didn't, for example, study English literature at university. So like I said, I'm familiar with the majority of women in this book. Some of them I've read, some of them I'm aware of their names or their kind of most famous work. When I was a bookseller, I also sold these books, not in huge quantities, but they were also readily available in a chain bookstore, so not a kind of specialist bookstore. Not all of them, but it's like a kind of like significant amount. And so I do wonder with this if that something is lost in translation from English to American, if perhaps a lot of these women make it onto the English canon but not onto the Western canon. I will say that I did struggle to place her project of rediscovery of these women onto a kind of like time frame. I don't know if this is 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. A lot of the writers that she mentioned are readily available in Penguin Classics, Penguin English Library, Oxford World Classics, etc. Again, that might just be in England and not America. The chapter that I found the weakest in this is where she draws a through line from Jane Austen as a mother of kind of romance to contemporary romance writers. I'm very much in the camp of Jane Austen being primarily a comedy of manners with a lot of satire thrown in there, and the romances are the vehicle for that. And so I, unlike Rebecca Romney, don't see a through line from Jane Austen. I think the example she uses as a contemporary romance writer would be Elisa Cole. I think that is a little bit of a leap. I find the argument made in this, and the argument that is so prevalent kind of online and on BookTube, that what I would consider valid criticisms of the romance genre as it is today are inherently misogynistic. I feel like that's a failure to kind of engage with the argument and is kind of like a bit of a cop-out. One of the points that she comes back to throughout this that I really did agree with is that we should view the canon, the Western canon in this case, as a starting point. I think it's a really good thing to want to read the best books and novels, in this case, that you can read, the most profound, the most beautifully written, the most kind of moving, the most reflective of experience. That's not a negative thing for me. And to do that, you have to practice discernment and judgment on what you choose to read, because we all have limited time and energy to do that. But that is a starting point for everybody. And then you say, and okay, what's next? Overall, I would definitely recommend this. And like I said, one of the things that I loved most about this was how relaxed and kind of informal the tone was. This is so far removed from being kind of like quite a dry academic text. I would definitely, if you're thinking about reading this for Jane Austen July, despite a few little issues that I had with it, I would definitely recommend it. The next book that I read kind of feels like cheating because I read the vast majority of this in March and April, but I moved house recently and I packed this away with like 30 pages to go. So when I unpacked it, I finished it, and it is Who is Big Brother by DJ Taylor. I've spoken about this loads before. This is a reader's companion to George Orwell. It goes through all of his fiction and non-fiction and kind of groups his novels and non-fiction writings by theme. So as an example, Coming Up for Air, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, and A Clergyman's Daughter are all grouped under status anxiety. The only thing I will say about this is, if you're familiar with George Orwell's novels, you read them before, this is a really good guide where you'll kind of get a lot more context and information from. If you haven't read them and you want to, this will probably spoil them for you, but overall I definitely recommend this. Next up is Burmese Days by George Orwell. I've done a whole review video on this, so I won't repeat myself other than to say this was, alongside the next book, my favourite reading experience of the entire month. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I took so much from it, and I can't wait to get to my next George Orwell. The next book is Ants Aren't Gentlemen by P.G. Wodehouse. This is the 15th Jeeves and Wooster, and most importantly, the last one in the series. I started reading them in 2017. They're reading one or two a year, not because I am kind of like lukewarm on them, but because I love them so much. I just wanted to take my time and enjoy it. I felt really quite emotional reading this because these books have come to mean like so much to me, and reading them has become such a highlight. One of the standout things that I think about P.G. Wodehouse that I think is also comparable to Barbara Pym is that they get to a point where they hone and refine their novels, which are all very similar in kind of plot and subject. For P.G. Wodehouse, he refines and hones until he gets to write Ho Jeeves, which is the perfect Jeeves novel, and then he just kind of maintains that right until the end of the series. It's kind of hard plot-wise to distinguish a Jeeves and Wooster book from other Jeeves and Wooster books. Having said that, they're all absolute perfection, and I will read these over and over and over again. The writing is perfect in this, the turn of the language, the humour, the characters who you've come to kind of know over the course of 15 books. In this, Betty Wooster, on the advice of his doctor, retreats to a quiet life in the country, but becomes involved in hijinks involving a stolen cat and a horse race. I think I listened to a podcast recently on Ho Jeeves, on the secret life of books, and I think one of the things that they said is that the situations like in Wodehouse novels, in Jeeves, in Blandings, are really quite trivial, but the emotions of the characters are not, and that's what kind of resonates with people. And I think that is so true. Wodehouse, Austen and Pym, I think, all do something really similar, which is kind of the art of like perfect observation. They deal in what is quite a narrow like social strata of their characters, but their novels are like perfectly observed. So that's my last Jeeves and Wooster. I will go to Blandings next, to Lord Emsworth and others, which I have the audiobook on hold on BorrowBox. But yeah, when I finished this, I felt quite emotional. I adore these novels and would just highly recommend them to everybody. Next up is a poetry collection by Helen Farish, or Farish, I'll have to check. I'm trying to get back into the swing of things with poetry. And so I picked up this. This was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, I want to say in like 23 or 24. And it's an account of the start, end, and then aftermath of a relationship. And this is, I think, a verse sequence. So it's not a kind of loosely held poetry collection. It's part of like an interlinking set of poems that essentially tell you a story. I found this really riveting, really moving. It's really simplistic, but has tons of depth. And this has a kind of epigraph from Villette by Charlotte Bronte, so I just immediately knew that it was going to be for me. But yeah, I loved this. Don't let the bad cover fool you. This was kind of astounding poetry collection, the best I've read in quite a long time. I read a review online of this that compared this kind of inform to birthday letters, which is quite a big comparison to live up to, but I do kind of understand where they were coming from. But yeah, I'd highly recommend this if you're into poetry. Right, let's head to crime. The next book I read was A Murder is Announced by Agatha Christie. This is the 5th Miss Marple, and I'm rereading Agatha Christie in series order. Not in publication order, but I'm rereading Miss Marple and Prowl Row, and I think I'll also get to Tommy and Tuppence as well. I've been waiting for A Murder is Announced because it's one of the Miss Marples that I haven't read before, and I know that this has a lot of fans. This is one of the best Miss Marples that I've read. This is set in the village of Chipping Cleghorn, which I think is safe to assume somewhere in the Cotswolds. The novel opens as a murder is announced in a local village newspaper. A kind of party gathers at the time advertised, and lo and behold, a murder does happen. The mystery in this is really well done. The cast of characters in this is fantastic. The village setting of Chipping Cleghorn, I loved in this. This has a parlour reveal at the very end. It's one of the kind of longer Miss Marples, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. There's also an amazing passage in this on the social upheaval wrought by the Second World War and how it makes the conditions for this particular murder possible. In this, and I don't think that this is a spoiler, there are characters who are not who they say they are. Whereas before the Second World War, it would have been very rare for complete strangers to move into a village like Chipping Cleghorn. They would usually have family connections, or they will have served with, for example, in the Royal Navy with somebody who already lives in the village, or they would have kind of letters of introduction. The Second World War changes that, and it changes it for good. There are refugees, returning soldiers, war widows, people who have moved throughout the country for war work. And because of that, you have to take people at their word that they are who they say they are. And in this book, that is not always the case. But yeah, I really recommend this if you're looking for a good Miss Marple. The kind of intricacies of the mystery in this are really good. Right, the last book I read in May is another literary biography. I've been listening to this on audiobook throughout spring, and it is The Rural Hours by Harriet Baker, The Country Lives of Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Townsend Warner and Rosamond Lehman. I like this a lot, but I will say this is very earnest, and I like my literary biographies with a little bit more snark. This is separated into chapters on the writers as they move to the English countryside in times of transition for all of them. So as an example, Virginia Woolf moves to the Sussex countryside to Asham House as she is recovering from a nervous breakdown. I found her chapters really moving because they're focused on how her rural living kind of tethers her to life. My favourite chapters in this were definitely the Rosamond Lehman ones. She is, I would say, of the three, the most kind of small C conservative, the most traditional in her life, in her marriage, her writing, her appearance. I thought her chapters on living in the countryside during the war were fascinating. This relies heavily on their journals, their letters, their writings, and it is mainly an account of those. I would have loved to see a little bit more context. I think what was missing from this is a kind of critical eye. As an example, I found the Sylvia Townsend Warner chapters a little bit trying, mainly because I just found her completely infuriating as a person. As an aside, I read a novel from her in March or April, which I absolutely loved, called The Corner That Held Them. So her writing I admire greatly. I just, during her chapters, found myself kind of rolling my eyes. I couldn't escape the sense that she was role-playing a life in the country and was largely quite inauthentic. As an example, there's one point where Sylvia Townsend Warner is feeling a little bit hypocritical perhaps a little bit guilty about buying a cottage called Miss Green in the countryside when she knows that she is part of an influx of middle-class intellectuals, quite bohemian Bloomsbury types, moving to the countryside to kind of embrace their creativity, because that was in vogue at the time. And she knows that a local rural working class person could and probably should be living in that cottage. She's told, I think, by what would be an estate agent or auctioneer not to worry because nobody else kind of is able to buy the house. And I would love to know if that was true. Could like the rural working class afford to live in those types of cottages in that time period? Were they priced out of the market? How many kind of middle class people were kind of moving to the countryside at that point? I would have loved to know the wider context, but it was touched on, but the context was never given. If you like the authors in this, I would definitely recommend this, because I think one of the standout things of this is that it's touching on periods of their lives that kind of haven't had the recognition that they deserved in terms of kind of inspiration for their work. As an example, I mainly think of Virginia Woolf as an urban writer. That this has made me evaluate that. But yeah, I'm just thinking of some literary biographies I've read over the course of the past year, like Laura Thompson's Take 6 Girls, like Who is Big Brother, that just have a more critical eye. But overall, I mean, I bought a copy of this when I was listening to the audiobook, so I did enjoy it. That was my last book of the month. Right, that's it. This has been lovely. Like I said, a really great reading month. I'm currently partway through 3 books. The God of the Woods by Liz Moore, Our Mutual Friend, and The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing. We'll see how I crack on with those. I have a holiday in June. I'm off work for 2 weeks, which I cannot wait for. So hopefully, fingers crossed, a lot of reading in June. If things could carry on as they are, I would love that. If you've read any of these, I would love to know what your thoughts are. And I will see you all in a video soon.